Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Khury Petersen-Smith, who is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He researches U.S. empire, borders, and migration, graduated from Clark University and Graduate School of Geography in Massachusetts after completing a dissertation that focused on militarism and sovereignty. He is one of the co-authors and organizers of the 2015 Black Solidarity with Palestine statement, which has signed by over 1,100 Black activists, artists, and scholars. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Really honored.
It's a pleasure to have you. So you're in D.C.?
I'm actually in Boston now.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask how things have been over the last week or so. What has it been like in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, Boston is it's all right. We're a little we're insulated in some ways from some of the kind of harsher things happening in this country right now. We have a Republican governor who is like neoliberal tool, but he is not like a Trump Republican, you know what I mean? And so he's constantly distancing himself from Trump. And it's really interesting because it shows how much it matters when people in power amplify, that fascist message. It really puts wind in their sails. And I think it's more challenging for them when that's not the case. So in that way, things are not the very worst. But Boston it's an unaffordable city, like so many cities in this country and in this world. COVID has been hitting certain communities harder than others. It's really hard. It's really hard. It's very intense. So we're all part of this, whatever kind of degree that we're dealing with it,
Yeah.
The various aspects of this time, we're all dealing with a really difficult situation,
100%. Are you originally from Boston?
I actually grew up in upstate New York.
Oh, okay.
But I've lived here for a long time now. I've lived here like half of my life, and I wanted to live here since when I was a kid. I mean, I love upstate New York too. Kind of claim dual citizenship.
Right on. What part of upstate New York?
I'm from Albany.
Okay, right on.
Yeah,
right
yeah.
on.
So not too far from here, actually.
Is that where you got first engaged with political work?
Yeah, Albany's a small city, but there's some really, like when I was growing up, there were some really rad activists who were doing really great stuff. And, first of all, there's a lot of bad stuff happening as is the case all across this country. And I remember when I was in high school, like police violence was rampant. And, I got to see a bit of that. And I learned about Palestinians and the kind of oppression that Palestinians were experiencing in Palestine. And even though I didn't know Palestinian folks, in my little hometown, that really politicized me, and I was able to connect up with these activists at this really cool place called the Social Justice Center in Albany. And these were activists who were active. They were veterans of previous movements, and in particular, the ones who I ended up connecting with were involved in the Central America solidarity struggles of the 1980s.
Right on. Right on.
So, I feel really lucky to have kind of just encountered those folks, and that helped me get political and get active.
Was your family political?
Not terribly political, but they were like my parents. My parents aren't activists, but they were shaped by, the 60s and 70s that they grew up in.
Right.
And so that time so politicized everyone. And I've thought a lot about that actually, as somebody who is an activist, who is, I mean, my sort of day job is as a scholar, and not just my day job, but my life's work, I guess,
Yeah.
is kind of studying and interrogating U.S. empire and building solidarity. But I'm also an organizer, you know what I mean? And that's what I learned when I was in college, is how to organize people. And I've thought a lot about like what it means when it's not just the kind of most committed people who get active, but a movement politicizes like many layers of people, kind of radiates out, and it has an impact well beyond that core.
Yeah.
And I think that my parents are absolutely examples of that, and I'm grateful for them. I mean, they weren't activists, but they taught me about the civil rights movement. They taught me really cool stuff about Black history in particular. And I'm also just grateful for the era that they came up in, because that shaped them. And then even though I didn't grow up in that era, it shaped me.
Yeah. I was going to ask how long you've been with IPS and what were some of the kind of like movements or organizations you might have worked with before becoming a full-time scholar?
Yeah, so I've been with IPS for a couple of years now, and the anti-war movement was really formative for me. I should say that, and I started to kind of get at this when I was talking about being in high school and learning about the struggle for Palestine. But like there were all these, I mean, there's no shortage of injustices kind of in this place and in my immediate, experience to kind of make me political.
Right.
But actually, like so much of what shaped my worldview was things happening outside of my experience, but that connected with it. And so it was like, yeah, learning about Palestinians fighting for freedom. It was learning about Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico fighting against the U.S. Navy. There was this long struggle for this island as part of Puerto Rico called Vieques, which was like a test. The Navy used to test weapons and stuff, and that really like politicized me. And then when the U.S. invaded Iraq and Afghanistan,
How old were you then, Khury?
I was in college when that happened.
Okay.
And it was pretty wild because my college, Rochester Institute of Technology, I'm going to name it, was like so many schools like it plays a very active role in the military machine. And there's this kind of history at RIT of that's a bit more clandestine, where it was revealed in the at some point in the 90s that like the president of RIT was actually a CIA agent while he was the president, and so there's all this clandestine stuff happening. But when when the war on terror started, they were very openly celebrate. We are so proud to be making weapons on our campus, And so I learned a lot because I not only learned a lot about how the military, how U.S. militarism is so beyond the formal military, right? There's all these other institutions that are enlisted as part of it. But then I learned a lot about, in both good ways and bad ways, about what it means to live in a country that is so militarized. I just remember being an organizer and setting up a literature table and talking to students about like, hey, let's stop the war. And I remember talking to kids who were like, you know what, I'm on my way to class to learn how to design missiles. Right. So I'm pretty psyched about the war. Right. And I'm like, yo, okay. And I guess I hope this gets at your question a bit, but like it's made me, there was a point like look, I think it's extremely important to build solidarity amongst folks here with folks elsewhere who are on the receiving end of U.S. violence, and violence that the U.S. funds and supports, in Iraq and Palestine, in Afghanistan, all over the world. But there was a point, once I kind of committed to really studying how U.S. empire works, I thought a lot about like, what does it do to this place, actually? like to just be at war forever.
Yep.
And I should say that another formative, as I was learning about Palestine and Puerto Rico, like I was learning about just the colonization of this place and the theft from Native Americans and indigenous resistance. And it's like that is the context from which the United States emerges as a project. Mm-hmm. And it's just been nonstop ever since. And then, so anyway, all of that, I think pointed me to ultimately getting to work at IPS. And I feel really lucky. I feel really grateful. There's somebody named Phyllis Bennis who's been on your show before. Yeah. And when I was a student doing anti-war organizing, I would read her scholarship, and now I get to work with her. So I feel really lucky.
It's really cool. I have had the same experience with many people that I used to look up to when I was first getting involved with the anti-war movement. And it's really neat. It is really cool to finally work hand in hand with people you might have looked up to for years. It's a cool experience. Why don't you, before we get into some current events, why don't you kind of tell folks what IPS is and sort of the work that IPS does?
Yeah, good question. Because it's funny because I guess it's a think tank, and there's a million of those in Washington. And when I got when I got the job and I moved to Washington, when I started out working at IPS, I got a sense of just the role that think tanks play in shaping U.S. policy. People in Congress get on the floor and they articulate the policy, but that stuff's really developed in the think tanks, Right. And what's unique about IPS is that it was created to be a think tank for social movements, So, the idea is that, the idea behind think tanks is that, this is the generous description of a think tank, right? Is that policymakers don't have time to, have super in-depth knowledge of all these things, of all the different things that inform policy. And therefore you need people whose job it is to kind of think about this stuff and distill the best ideas to inform policy. Again, that is the very generous part. Says nothing about who is funding those think tanks, the corporation, right. The various governments around the world, et cetera. But, if we take that idea and say, okay, for social movements, for activists, activism is there's so many different aspects to it, but it is hard work organizing people, Yep. And so, what if a bunch of us, our role could be to take that time and space and get to do some scholarship and some investigation and some reflection and talking to, very intentionally talking to other activists or other scholars and trying to, again, gather some of the best lessons and knowledge that can inform the social movements. And, of course, activists themselves, are intellectuals, are scholars, but to get to play that role, to be like, what, I want to write a whole report on this thing. Or yesterday, actually, I was looking through last year's military budget. It's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And, I found some really interesting stuff in there about what gets funded and what doesn't get funded. Not all activists have the time to comb through this, this document, right? So that's the idea behind IPS. And we do, I work on the kind of foreign policy end of things, but we do foreign and domestic policy.
Right on. I think one of the things that I would like to see is more, we talk about it locally all the time. So in a place like where we're located in Northwest Indiana, we have some commuter campuses. South Bend is about an hour away from us. So we're kind of in this no man's land of, there's not really too much research or studying happening. But the thing is, with the way the economy is today too, and the amount of people out of work who have advanced degrees who can kind of do that work, sit at home and do it. As you mentioned, we obviously encourage as much organic intellectualism as possible. We believe everybody has the capacity to do that. But to your point, there's some people who might just have more time and specific skill sets to do it. And I think regional think tanks are something that we've been kind of mulling over for a while, because as you know, there are national issues that filter down to all of us, and we're all impacted differently depending on who you are and where you're located. But then there's also so many sort of specific local and regional issues that, it'd be really helpful for people, I think, at the local and regional level to be able to develop their own studies and research. But it's something that I've thought about for a long time. Like, I wish, in other words, we had an IPS in like every corner of every state in the U.S. is what I would like to see.
Right. I love that. And I love it for so many reasons, one being, we have some real challenges in the society. You know what I mean? Like, we got a lot to figure out about how to make a more just, more equal, more livable, more survivable, sustainable society. And it's going to take a lot of thinking. Yeah. So, and there's this thing, the U.S. is really the kind of dominant institutions and culture of the U.S. is very hostile to intellectual engagement. It's like when when I was studying what I was studying in school, which is like militarism. People are like, I have people who are like, what, you can get paid doing that? Like, does that work really matter? Is kind of the question, right? And that's true. That's so true with all kinds of scholarship. Of course, there's these tropes of making fun of English majors or philosophy majors as though it's not useful to like reflect on language and on thinking, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's super important. And the other piece is like, I really believe that social change is possible like at every level of society, and like cities and towns and rural spaces are really important sites of generating, new possibilities and experimentation. Like, so I think about that a lot, about what becomes possible locally and regionally. And I love the idea of people very intentionally saying, let's think about this and let's facilitate thinking, because there's lots of people who are thinking, right?
Yeah. And institutionalize it. I mean, the thing for us is like building organizations and institutions that can outlast this time period, our lives, something that lasts well beyond us. And I think that's really important, just that intentionally building an infrastructure that can support these kind of efforts for the long term. So in other words, I'm not interested in like starting a regional think tank so it disappears in 3 or 4 years when the grant money runs out. It's like, how do we develop a think tank that can last here 30, 40, 50 years, I think is really the question. And to your point about these areas, look, Sergio and I, who you can't see, is behind the camera here, but, we opened our community center here in Michigan City in 2016 for basically that very reason. I mean, after seeing the election results, all of our friends who we had been mobilizing with for, at that point, about 11 years, doing anti-war work and environmental organizing and different things, they were like, come to Portland, come to Seattle. They're like, come to San Francisco or Oakland. They're like, get the hell out of there. And we're like, look, like for us, the lesson of 2016 was you cannot allow this kind of, these white power movements, these right-wing hyper-nationalist movements to sort of ferment here and just to like, just let it kind of fester, because if there's not an alternative, what fills that vacuum. And, we kind of saw that on Wednesday.
Exactly.
But that was our thinking behind it, is like, you cannot allow huge swaths of this country to just go. It just doesn't make it, to me, doesn't make political sense. I'm not sure what you think about that, but I'm encouraged by Georgia. Not probably everything somebody like you and I would want, but still a really positive move. And if you listen to the organizers on the ground, something that people have been working on for like 8 to 10 years, progressive black churches, black student organizations, labor unions down there. I mean, it was really an amazing effort. It was a shame to me. One of the biggest shames about Wednesday was that it overshadowed the great work that was done in Georgia the night before. That actually upset me probably just as much as anything else.
Yeah, that's so real. I mean, there really is, there are just these, I don't know, like these caricatures of whole sections of the country, you know what I mean? That dominate in Washington and in New York, and it's like, it's obnoxious and it's condescending, but it also just doesn't serve us well, it's not an accurate representation of what this society actually looks like. So yeah, I think it's immensely important, the kind of organization, the kind of engagement that you're talking about. And like some of the most inspiring and impactful resistance movements of our time come from places that are totally overlooked. I think about like Standing Rock Uprising, like
Yeah.
in the history of, the world, in my opinion, it is like had a profound impact. I mean, there were people, like, obviously it impacted this country in ways that are lasting. And of course there's current struggles for, indigenous freedom and to reclaim the land and water and protect the water and so on. But like, man, that there's still reverberations from Standing Rock, and like people from all around the world, like indigenous people from around the world mobilized to Standing Rock, right?
Yep.
In like the Plains region is totally overlooked, disparaged. The other thing is, like, I think because of that kind of these condescending, elitist caricatures, particularly, I want to say, of liberals kind of caricaturing, Midwestern, working people. It allows conservatives to step in and say, well, we represent these people. And it's so abusive. It's like, I think about West Virginia and, coal miners in West Virginia or in Western Pennsylvania. Like, we never hear about these people until it's time to do something reactionary. Then all of a sudden the coal miner is the most important worker, and how dare you abandon, how can we let down our coworkers? And it's like, y'all don't care. I mean, these people, like, generation after generation, are dying of black lung and all kinds of, horrendous diseases. The land is poisoned. You don't care about them. And then all of a sudden they're useful when it comes to justifying, coal or like fracking or, something like utterly reactionary. Then all of a sudden you're interested in rural people. It
is abusive because people have been so beat down in the neoliberal era that, as you know, in some of these regions, like where we live, there's been so much deindustrialization that anything that looks like it's a better job than $8 an hour at the local fast food place, hey, we're taking it. And they, and it's like leveraging people's despair against them. And it's disgusting. And then the laws we have, of course, with all the states' rights, it's a race to the bottom. So in Indiana, we're constantly telling people in Chicago, if you don't want to pay taxes, if you don't want regulation, if you want to buy as many guns as you want with no restrictions, come out to us, And then that forces the lawmakers in Illinois to go, well, wait a minute, maybe we got to adjust our taxes and maybe cut here, do some austerity here, because we don't want the middle-class whites to be leaving the city because they, that whole race to the bottom and then playing each other off of each other is like really destructive. And anything for me at this point, especially in light of what's happened over the last 4 years and even the last week, anything that goes against trying to build solidarity is just like the most destructive thing right now. I mean, I think our side, and here I'm talking really broad, like liberal, progressive, left, radical, however we want to go down that line, like we really do need to create like a united front right now. Like there is no time for like sectarian dogmatism or like beating each other up over petty differences or like even past issues. People like maybe we've worked together for 10 years and in 2014 we had a falling out over some electoral dispute. Like it's time to put all of that stuff aside, in my view.
I've been thinking the same thing, like, and I know, I am not like innocent of holding, having some dispute at some point with someone, and I'm like, we need to work it out because this is a rough situation. I mean, on one hand, like the promise is so big. Like I keep thinking, just one example, like, last year when you had these like black-led uprisings all across the country, I just, there was a point at which like more than 70% of the US population said they sympathized with Black Lives Matter. And I was like, what? Like that explodes so many notions of, who Americans are and what we think and all this stuff. And there is so much possibility there. So I don't want to say it's just doom and gloom, but the dangers are real.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It
Yeah.
is very bad. And so, yeah, there's got to be a way. And I have to say, like, I've been lucky enough to get to travel like a little bit, just like totally through activist context. You know what I mean? Getting invited to
Yeah.
speak someplace, and just seeing how, like, in other places, like what a more mature and united left can look like. And I'm like, wow, we have a lot to learn. I mean, it's not like, I mean, there are places in this world where, folks, progressives, leftists, liberals, it's not like they don't disagree with each other. They know when it's time to mobilize together.
Yeah. Yeah.
We really have to figure that out.
I agree. I think we will. The only silver lining I can see, well, a few. One of them might be a fractured Republican Party, which would be great for us. But the other side is like, I do think, I mean, Sergio and I have heard from people, non-identified, just folks we grew up with over the last week. And if anything, this might have kind of lit a fire under people's butts in terms of like how serious the situation is. I think some people in some communities kind of get that inherently and knew what this was going to be 4 years ago. But I think now it's starting to hit a whole new wave of people who are going outside of, like you were saying, that sort of core, outside to the periphery of like, I kind of identify with this stuff. And now they're saying, wait a minute, like something is going on that's fundamentally wrong and we have to do something about it. And I think then it's up to us to mobilize those people and like show them, hey, there is an alternative. It doesn't have to be this or despair, apathy, sitting at home with cynicism, just hating everything.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, and we play a role in that alternative, right? Because that's one of the things I've been really very worried about is, so you have like fascists on the march, right? And then what we are offered is that the solution is like the state. Don't worry, we're going to bring in more cops. We're going to pass more legislation that classifies more people as terrorists. We're going to put soldiers on the streets of DC. Don't you feel safe?
Yeah.
And it's like that. And so it's like there's two actors on that stage. One is like the far right and the other is like the state. And it's like, what I hope we can find, for ourselves and kind of, or refine, because we did it last year and we've been doing it for several years, but like popular mobilization has to be, we have to lead this conversation, and say, well, wait a minute, more police are not going to make us safer, actually. And guess what? A bunch of the police are fascists,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, new laws. That doesn't seem to make any sense to me. I am interested, though. I do think that there has to be a question around, well, two things. One is a question about what the state is. I mean, I think the real thing that we have to examine, and I come from the anti-war movement I was involved with was probably more influenced by like anarchist thinkers. So like my initial coming to was much more under that sort of like anarchist scope of viewing the world. That started to change. I think there's been several things that have changed that. One has been learning more about climate change. And then speaking with friends overseas and trying to think about like at scale, what are the kinds of programs and institutions that would need to function in order to deal with a challenge that big. At the same time, I think one of the other issues that came up was the 2015, 2016 Bernie campaign, where it was like, oh, wow, like after rejecting electoral politics for so long, I hated Bush, and then the Democrats took the House and Senate in 2006, didn't do shit, and then Obama, and I was so done with anything electoral. 2016 hit, and I thought, wow, here are people, like there's people coming into the movement that I had never met before that were just fresh and like new. I don't want to ramble too much about this, but I do think that there's like a really interesting debate and conversation to be had on the left right now about what is our orientation to the state. Because some of the conversation sometimes is also very different than like, say in our community, our city is 1/3 Black. We live 20 miles from Gary, Indiana, which remains one of the blackest cities in the country. We're 40 miles from South Bend. And even here, like, the conversation, say, about something like defunding, it was a non-issue for us because there's not enough in our city budget to defund anything. It's like there is no money to defund places like Gary or South Bend or Michigan City because the cops are already making shit wages and, you know, all the rest. And not on top of that, too, one of the differences, I think, was even in the communities, particularly amongst, say, older black people in our community here in Michigan City, they were asking for more police at a time when people were calling for less police. And this was difficult for like people from the outside, like leftists and progressives who would be like, oh, but like people of color are just together, right? And it's like, oh my goodness, like, you know, it's not a homogenous community. There's a lot of nuances and contradictions and all of those things. And it, I think, started what a real interesting conversation would be, say, for us here in Michigan City. We obviously have an institutional, systemic, historical critique of policing, where it comes from and all the rest. But also understanding that, like, in a community like this where we have a black police chief who's actually well respected, like this is somebody who prior was like the school kind of administration person. So like people know him. It's not like, oh, this is a token person who just was put there for some reason. Like, no, he can like literally walk down any block in Michigan City and like go up to people's houses and be like, what's up? Like, I went to high school with your mom, you know? So it's like a different, how this plays out in different areas is also super interesting to me. So like even here in Indiana, and I don't want to ramble too much because I want to get ideas from you. Even here in Indiana, it was like, well, the conversation in Indianapolis might look a lot different than it does in Michigan City, might look a lot different than it does in Gary. And I think one of the challenges we found over the last 9 months was trying to apply like a sort of blanket policy to a whole bunch of places that generally would agree. Like if we had a police force that was disproportionately funded compared to our social services, we know there would be plenty of people in the community who would be like, look, let's shift the money around. But that didn't exist. So for us, it's like, what does this look like? And also even state intervention. And this is the last thing I'll say. After doing enough local work in Indiana, we quickly found out the limitations of municipal politics in a state that's trifecta controlled by Republicans at the House, Senate, and at the governorship. And they've passed so many preemptive laws downstate that like now at the municipal level, we can't raise the minimum wage. We can't raise property taxes, income tax, corporate tax. We can't do our own like environmental regulations if we want to. Like we are very hemmed up by like what we can do by state law. So then that's where like federal programs or big national programs come into play, because not only do we not have the resources, but our internal political situation in a place like Indiana is so dysfunctional and so far to the right that if we don't have that sort of federal government state response, the ability for us to even get the kind of goods and services that we need is like virtually impossible. And now, if it were up to me, we would be doing that plus Cooperation Jackson type organizing, plus electoral but you only have so much time and capacity. And I think as all organizers and activists, that seems to be like the primary question all the time for us. Like, what are the priorities? What's going to get more? What's going to expand your base? What's going to help you build power? And what's going to make a real difference in people's lives so they actually feel like they can come back and be a part of something that's winning? That was a long response to something you said. And
but it's so real. I mean, it is exactly, I think, what we should be discussing. And it really, it points to, I mean, okay, so this might seem like a little counterintuitive, but so on one hand, like, I think that one is just, it's just, this conversation for me is a reminder that this is like a massive country, you know what I mean? And like, there are some shared conversations we're having, but there's a lot of variation, you know what I mean, in terms of what things look like. And I think that we really need a politics that can speak to that diversity and that range. And that's like an invitation, to people from all these different corners to say, we can talk about neoliberalism. Let me tell you what it looks like here.
Yep.
Because it's different. And Boston is one of the richest cities in the world where I live. Right. And yet there's like poverty. You know what I mean? Like it's different. Or like, there's people who can't access higher education here, but there's like literally dozens and dozens of colleges and universities. For here, it's very different because it's like abundance.
Yeah.
That's like very visible in some ways, hidden in other ways, of course, as it always is. But it's also, it's like inaccessible, even though it's like literally it surrounds us.
Right.
That's different from what you're describing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that kind of zoomed in perspective is super important. And at the same time, I'm reminded of like just that basic point that we are all interconnected. You know what I mean? Like when we talk about redistributing the wealth, I mean, it's very easy for me to imagine like all of the wealth in the financial district in downtown Boston. You know what I mean? Or like, there's this hedge fund manager here named Seth Klarman. He personally owns, I believe it's $1 billion of Puerto Rico's debt. Like this one guy, you know what I mean? And I know where his office is. I know where the building is, like there's wealth right here, right? And so it's very easy for me to imagine redistributing that here and, to Puerto Rico or whatever. But like, for places in this country and around this world that have been systematically neglected, have been, whose economies have been structured just so they can be, the economy takes from these places. Yeah. Then redistributing the wealth, it can't just be like you in your town redistributing your budget, right? It's got to be like all this wealth, right?
Yep.
And then we can have that conversation on a global level because, even in the, it's like, it's funny. I remember when I was, I had a classmate and we would talk about what it means to be, there's these terms, core and periphery, where we talk about the world system. You can get the core of the system or the periphery of the system. And we would talk, she's
Emmanuel Wallerstein, isn't it?
Wallerstein, yeah. And she, she's a Latina from Lubbock, Texas, and I'm like a Black guy from upstate New York. We talked about like, well, what does it mean to be at the periphery of the core? You know what I mean?
Yep.
Which I think a lot of us in this country experience.
Yep.
Then you zoom out and it's like, well, there's the wealth of the US, which has not just been generated within the US, but has been extracted from all around the world. So it's like that thing of we all really need each other. And I think that the challenge for those of us who are organizers, who have this kind of big vision, like an extensive vision, is like, how do you break it down so that people understand that even if you've never met somebody in Palestine or Bangladesh, I promise you, your fate is bound with them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And
like, it really is the thing that if one of us rises, we'll all rise. And then when one of us falls, we really all fall, and there's a real finesse that I think we have to develop to be able to have that conversation. But I think we got to figure it out because that's the world,
The last 10 months, as horrific as they've been, much like last Wednesday, if I could find any silver lining, it might be precisely what you're saying, which is like this ability to generate consciousness around interconnectedness. Because if anything, I think over the last 10 months, people have sort of seen like, oh shit, if my neighbor doesn't have a mask, or if this person doesn't have healthcare, or if this person doesn't get vaccinated, then that means I'm at risk. And I mean, it's terrible that that's how I think sometimes we learn things, but I'm also guilty of that. It took me going to the war in Iraq to kind of snap out of it and become politicized. And I don't think, in other words, I think all organizers and activists have to intentionally try and drum that up. Like, we can't just assume it will just happen organically. But at the same time, I do think it's a great opportunity to really inject that kind of like solidarity, collectivity, that interconnectedness, that we all rely on each other. And in a culture that's so hyper individualistic and just ruthlessly atomized, like everybody just, feeling disconnected from their community, and now even worse under the pandemic. That to me might be one of those silver linings, where people really see that my fate is intertwined with yours, and I just can't kind of hunker down at my house and take care of me and my family and let everything else just kind of go to shit, because it's not going to help anyone. I think that's real. I do think to some degree that's real.
it's so real. And it's like it's like we're kind of faced with this choice of like, yeah, we can, when you have this pandemic that's threatening all of our lives, you can go, in the very American, like, individual, you can be like, I'm going to hoard all the toilet paper or whatever.
Right.
That's one direction you can go in. Or you can be like, wow, like, yeah, it's not just that we all have to wear masks, but it's like, if there are refugee camps in this world where just masses of people are utterly abandoned, and yet no matter how abandoned you are, we really are all connected. Nothing. I mean, that's the lesson of the coronavirus. Nothing stays where it is.
Yep.
So if these refugee camps exist and people there don't have access to healthcare, we will never be rid of this thing.
Right.
It will literally never. It can't possibly end.
Yep.
And I mean, I think kind of getting at what you're saying, like, I want to believe, and I think that this is true for many of us and can be true for more of us, that like the humanity alone of the people in those camps is enough to commit to fighting, alongside them. But even if you're not sold on that, know this: you will be, your livelihood
Right.
will be threatened. You will never be safe.
Yeah.
Right? If they're not safe.
It's a tough balance. It's something that I learned during my anti-war activism, was like this ability to bounce between challenging people's morals and sort of ethical predispositions. Like, hey, like what does the dominant society say? But then how do you feel about this? And look what we're doing to people. But at the same time, I think one of the things I should have done earlier in my anti-war activism was really connecting it in a real way for people here. I mean, so in other words, projects like the National Priorities, I believe it's called National Priorities Project. Yeah, like that's an awesome project. Like these projects that really show people like, hey, in your community here, as soon as that project started, any anti-war speech I gave, I was using their data. So it's like
Awesome.
Going to small towns throughout the Midwest or really throughout the country. I mean, like, hey, here in Bridgman, Michigan, you could have this, right, and this, but we're spending it on war. And I would find, you get some of the people in the audience who would be horrified just morally about what was going on. But you'd also have people who are there and bound up in whatever ideological
Right.
things they're bound up in, and, kind of thinking, well, yeah, but what happens if we cut the budget, or what happens if we do this? And really showing people, I think, made a difference. Because I know I'm already taking a lot of your time, and I want to get to your scholarship. I want to get to like the things you're working on and what we need to know, like, because I'm here to also learn from you today. And I want to really, really ask a couple things we mentioned in our email. You had noted that you could see this year being sort of a turning point for the war on terror, and I was very interested in what you meant by that. And now, I think most people know the context. We have Joe Biden coming into office. I'm sure people like you and I aren't pleased about that. Happier than it being Donald Trump. But then just today, I believe they announced that Samantha Powers was going to be one of, right. So, we take the good with the bad every day. We just keep rolling with punches. What do you make of the incoming Biden administration wrapped up with like the war on terror and sort of where we go from here? It will be, 20 years pretty soon here.
It's so wild. It's so intense. I'll say that last year, early in the year, I ended up, when I was in DC, and I ended up going to this Senate hearing on the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. And it was super interesting because it was organized by senators who want to end that war, and they had military officers, Army officers, testifying about how they have lied to Congress over years, how they have, when Congress or other civilians charged with oversight or whatever have gone on delegations to Afghanistan, they have taken them to the places where they've wanted to take them, to show them what they've wanted to show them, and make sure that the money keeps on flowing. And these were admissions that should have been, scandalous.
Right.
And instead, it was just another day in Washington. And I thought, yo, these are senators who are saying this war should end, and yet it got funded again and again and again. So, the fact is, and whatever, people tuning into this won't be surprised to, but like there's this abundant evidence that the war on terror not only has been just catastrophic for humanity in the various countries where it is waged, which are so many, like so many. It has been catastrophic for people here in any number of ways. The unreal surveillance regime, particularly targeting Muslim folks, but also it has been a context to militarize the border. We've had, the Muslim ban flows right from the war on terror. Obviously, all of the policing, feeds into mass incarceration and inevitably disproportionately affects Black folks and this whole society at large, right? So it's been a disaster, but it also has just been ineffective. Like for a stated goal of fighting terrorism has just failed spectacularly. And, I think that's when I think about like, what is it about this time that offers some opportunity? Yeah, like you, I'm not particularly inspired by the Biden administration, in terms of what he has said, who he's appointing, or, he's not saying really that he wants to end the war on terror. But there's a bunch of things that have happened. And one of those is like, just in the past few weeks, we've gotten this just undeniable evidence of the failure of the war on terror and the kind of homeland security regime to do what is supposed to be its most important stated goal, which is like defend the nation.
Right.
In two ways. Obviously, there's what happened last week at the Capitol, which I don't even have to explain, the level of, I mean, at least failure and at most collaboration, whatever. We'll see what investigations reveal or whatever. But let's just say the Capitol was invaded not by Al Qaeda, not by, but by Americans. Yeah. But then, before that, this Christmas bombing of Nashville, by a man who was on the radar of the police, who knew he was making weapons, who announced that he was going to detonate this bomb. And yet these police who received the police training that all the police departments, of cities across this country have received the weapons from the Pentagon that police departments across the country have received. And with all of that, they couldn't prevent this bombing after they were warned? I mean, what an indictment of the whole regime of Homeland Security and the war on terror. And, there are already forces who are saying, especially in light of last week, that this is why we need more police, more soldiers, a bigger Pentagon budget. But I think that a lot of people are going to say, wait a minute, this makes no sense. So that's one thing. It's just like the facts have always been on our side, but they're kind of undeniable, I think, for larger numbers of people. So that's really good. And then, there have been, there are these particular cracks in particular parts of the war on terror. When I think, for example, about the war that the US has carried out and supported in Yemen, the US has had its own operations in Yemen, but the US also arms and funds Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which have waged this catastrophic war on Yemen. And there has been, there isn't nearly enough conversation about it in the society, but the people who are talking about it are disgusted about it. There have been great editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post about why this thing should end. And finally, even in Congress, particularly when Saudi Arabia is very openly, murdering dissenters, and dissidents and things like that. There's some people in Congress who are like, okay, maybe we should question our funding of this thing. So there's an opportunity there. And of course, I should say that those efforts were vetoed by Donald Trump. Yep. But I think now we should say, all right, Trump's gone. So what's good, Congress? Let's stop this thing, Yeah. There's any number of places where I think there's some possibilities, because the idea of ending the endless wars is popular in the US population. Yeah. What's maddening is that Donald Trump has positioned himself as the one who ends these wars, because and a big part of that is because the Democrats have been so committed to them,
Yeah.
But there's another piece of the puzzle, which is that there's a growing number of Democrats in Congress, not huge numbers, but very significant and very vocal numbers of folks who are willing to be critical of U.S. military spending, who are willing to criticize U.S. support for Israel, U.S. Military aid for Israel, which is very much wrapped up in the whole war on terror. So there's some possibilities there. And then the last thing, which is a little complicated, is that the U.S. really, the question of U.S. power on the world stage, I think the U.S. is facing some real challenges to maintain that supremacy. It has been number one since World War II, especially after the Soviet Union. Then number two fell, the Soviet Union fell, and then it was kind of a singular number one. And it's not the same picture that it was 20 years ago. I mean, if the whole idea of the war on terror was to cement U.S. supremacy, well, actually, we got a rising China. We got, in many ways, Iran. These states that the U.S. has deemed enemies, which we should not see as enemies, but the U.S. says that these are competitors and whatever.
Yeah. And a fractured EU.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. All these things that the U.S. kind of it's not in favor of U.S. power, and what that means is that there are people who run U.S. empire who are like, all right, we got to figure this out, and I don't think they agree on what to do, and I think that in so many ways the Trump administration is the expression of a lack. They don't there's no one person at the steering wheel. They don't know where to go. And so, Obama's like, you know what, I'm gonna put more naval ships and weapons in the Pacific and rally all of our Asian allies against China. That's gonna stop China. Well, it didn't. So Trump's like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna start a trade war, and I'm gonna, pull out of all these multilateral agreements and just, negotiate these transactional, bilateral agreements, or what he does all kinds of others. I'm gonna be tough on Iran and use the maximum pressure, thing. I'm going to threaten North Korea with annihilation, and then I'm going to try to make a deal with Kim Jong. He's trying to figure out all this stuff to save U.S. empire, and the U.S. empire is not stronger after Trump. So what that means is there's a conversation in Washington where some people, like Hillary Clinton, is like, look, maybe we should cut the military budget. She doesn't want to cut it, though, to make it less deadly. She wants to make it more. She's like, this is not efficiently deadly enough.
Right.
I think that we have an opportunity, though, to say, oh, did I hear cut the military budget? Yeah, we should, but not to prepare for China, but actually to stop these wars. We want to center the experiences of Somalis and Yemenis and Afghans and Iraqis. And by the way, we are for building international cooperation, with folks in China and Iran and elsewhere. So I just think that they're having one conversation, but we can kind of elbow our way into the room and have a different one.
No, 100%, man. I think the point you're bringing up about the fractured nature of the ruling class is very important, because all too often I think progressive left liberal activists see the ruling class sometimes as this like very coherent entity that always knows what it's doing, and it's always rational, and it always gets what it wants, and that's just not how the world works. And I think right now, I was going to ask, because this kind of leads into the question about support for Israel and the Iran nuclear deal, but I'm wondering if you also see an opportunity there because the ruling class is not as coherent as it maybe was once in the past. So like even moving into the Biden administration, re-engaging with Iran, really, I don't know if I could say holding Israel accountable at the least to stop facilitating Israel's brutalities and crimes. I mean, are you thinking sort of the same thing, that there's like kind of a similar opening because the ruling class is so fractured right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a convergence of a number of things, right? Because the other piece that I didn't mention in those factors is like, we also last year had this it's like weeks of uprising that were saying things like defund the police, which kind of which was an entry point into a bigger conversation about like, where do the police come from,
Yeah.
and but also what are our budgets spent on? And I think those of us who have an eye to like U.S. violence, not just in the United States but around the world, can say, oh, hey, if we're talking about the investment that we have in state violence rather than people's needs, I want to talk to you about not only defunding the police but defunding the Pentagon, right? So that converges. You know what I mean? Like I think that yeah, they're trying to work their stuff out in the ruling class, and then I think that more and more people are kind of primed to have a different conversation, and that's one of the reasons why one of the really interesting things about last week is this response of like, wow, the Capitol Police definitely treated those white fascists differently than they would have Black Lives Matter protesters. Even Joe Biden said that. Joe Biden is not a BLM, supporter.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it was so undeniable that he had to say something about it, or he would have seemed, totally out of touch. But that's how just almost universal, that sentiment was for so many people. There's an opportunity there, there's an opportunity to have a higher level of conversation then.
100%. No, I totally agree. What do you think specifically in terms of, let's say, Biden's first 100 days?
Yeah.
What are you expecting foreign policy-wise, and what openings do you think could come up? I'm assuming they'll announce that they want to re-engage in the Paris Treaty. I'm assuming they'll also want to re-engage in the Iran nuclear deal. Are you thinking sort of the same thing? And if you have additional items that you're assuming they'll address, please mention them.
Yeah, I think that they will speak to those things for sure. And, I think that that's great or whatever. That, I mean, those things should very obviously be, rejoined or whatever. Right. But they are also like woefully inadequate. I think that there's another example where the people running this country can have one conversation and say, see, we're rejoining the Paris deal. And it's like, that deal was not sufficient if we're talking about the level of...
Then it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Or like, if they're like, okay, we want to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, it's like, okay, well, y'all have parked aircraft carriers off the coast of Iran for a year straight. How about pulling those back? How about all those additional thousands of soldiers that you put in the Middle East, explicitly to counter Iran, which were on top of the soldiers that were already there?
Yeah.
How about reversing that? You know what I mean? And then how about suspending these sanctions immediately? So I think that we're going to have to push in those ways. And then there's things that are not, that I don't think Biden is, I don't know what they're thinking about, but I think that we should make issues, And so one thing that comes to mind is these huge weapons deals. Trump, in the last days of the Trump administration, he finally got, what they would consider a foreign policy win, which is kind of brokering a bunch of normalization deals between Israel and various states, in the Middle East and North Africa. And these were very obvious tit for tat kind of agreements, where a state would normalize its relations with Israel, and in a very transactional way, they would get something in response. And so for the United Arab Emirates, what they got out of the deal, they got a number of things, but one thing is a $23 billion weapons deal. That's what the Trump administration promised. Now, he wasn't able to actually make that sale go through before he left office. So now, it's up to a Biden State Department and a new Congress to approve those things. Right. I think that we should push and say, this deal should not go through. No more weapons to the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Israel, by the way, or Egypt. I mean, I got a long list.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, perhaps even that smaller issue that might not be as inflaming right away for people politically, to lead into the conversation about Saudi Arabia, which, to be honest with you, like you said with public opinion polls, I think one of the mistakes, I don't know what they're thinking at the top echelon, but I do think that like there are activists and organizers sometimes who make the mistake of underplaying where people are coming from, like, or assuming that people aren't as critical as they are. I kind of operate from the opposite assumption, which is that most people actually know what time it is, and if you just give them like maybe a few little ingredients that they could put together, like anyone we've taught about Saudi Arabia, they go, wait a minute, we shouldn't support these people, and or the government, we should not support that regime, and it's like very clear for them. So I think that's like something to keep in mind, is like sometimes the policy seems far out there, but the sentiment is there right now. I mean, even on the right, I mean, to what extent you can organize with folks is a different question, but like there is a sentiment in this country that we don't want to be in forever wars. There doesn't seem to be an appetite for new wars at all. And that, I mean, I think all of that, like you're saying, really plays in our favor. And I was going to ask you, to wrapped up with Biden, wrapped up with Iran and Israel and everything else we've talked about. I just recently saw, I think yesterday or the day before, you'll know this, I think Israel just launched different airstrikes in eastern Syria.
I hadn't seen that, actually.
Yeah, they had just, I think, launched 2 different strikes yesterday. I could look it up real quick, but believe it was yesterday, if not the day before. Killed Iranian fighters. They killed some Iraqi fighters. Wow. And then, of course, Syrians as well. And I guess the question I have is, what do you think the longer-term reconfiguration of power here? It's like, under Trump, as you saw, we saw this decline in U.S. hegemony for any number of reasons. I mean, he was doing a great job of tearing apart U.S. empire, but for all the wrong reasons.
Right.
Kind of like the Ron Paul people, like they're opposed to interventions, but for all the wrong reasons. I guess I wonder, what do you think so we've been talking about like that, which is what we're mostly interested in, that like bottom up power, what we can influence. But I'm also interested, what's the sense you get from just allies that we have, or former allies, or really non-aligned nations in the world, who are kind of looking at what's happening, saying, where do we go? Because the last time I was in Australia, it was a fascinating conversation between, on the one side, people who say culturally, politically, we're connected to Great Britain and the United States. Yeah. On the other hand, economically, we wholly depend upon the Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, and most importantly, China. And they're really like in this in-between area where they're going, wait a minute, we've got the U.S. bases here, but our economy wholly depends on what's happening in China. What's the sense you get amongst sort of U.S. allies moving into this era with Biden? I know that's a huge question for the last part of our conversation, but
it's a great question though, and it's I think one thing is there's this international system that was built after World War II that has governed just ways of doing things, with all sorts of institutions like the United Nations, a bunch of international law, financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, institutions like NATO, various alliances, right? And the various states of the world, I mean, that set of systems has been pretty disastrous for I would say the vast majority of the world's population, which includes people in so-called wealthy countries. Yeah. But of course, some countries have been hit much harder than others, right? That said, the U.S.'s allies, or the states that the U.S. looks to as allies, they kind of liked that system. I mean, Europe, Australia, Japan, they liked, a system where there are these kind of international multilateral institutions, as opposed to every country for themselves negotiating on a bilateral transactional basis, which is the Trump way of doing things. So on one hand, I think that a bunch of these sites, to kind of like a bunch of these states will say, oh, thank goodness, this will be back to normal. Kind of what Biden, I mean, in so many ways, when Biden says, it's going to go back to normal, America's ready to sit back at the head of the table, he's not just talking to the domestic audience, he's talking to his allies, right? But the kind of the real contradictions of the world economy and world politics, I mean, those are real, and it's complicated. As so, what exactly happens? I don't know. I think that countries like Australia are in a very complicated position. Um, the United States, because it has enjoyed such hegemony, has been able to say, look, at the end of the day, we're going to call the shots and you're going to listen to us. And will that continue forever? I don't know. Like if you're Australia and your economy is dependent on China,
Yeah.
it's complicated. Or in in a different way, Europe too. I mean, it's like that. There's just a different kind of reality. I guess the main thing I have to say is whatever solutions they come up with will not be good because all of these states are militarizing.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
all of them are militarizing their borders, and all of them are pursuing more or less, different degrees of neoliberal kind of agendas. Agendas that continue, a petroleum-based economy, an extractive economy. And so we already know, like the what we have been experiencing in terms of more armed conflict, more like displacement of people en masse through environmental catastrophes, through wars, through economic just devastation, the inability to make a living in whole parts of Africa, et cetera. You know, and then states responding to that not by saying, "Wow, our policies have displaced people. Let's welcome displaced people in and make sure they're taken care of with the abundant wealth that we have extracted from them."
Right.
The opposite: walls on the border. Stronger militaries to keep them out. And so it's like that is we've already gotten the preview of the 21st century, and that's basically what they have in store. And I think that Biden wants to more or less continue, those systems with a much, he's not going to call Haiti a shithole country,
Right.
but he's going to, but the actual policy, I don't think is going to be much different,
Right.
So, we've got a real challenge, which is like, how do we build solidarity across borders amongst ordinary people? And it's especially complicated because there's existing, what I think about all the wars the U.S. currently has going on, and the need to build solidarity with folks in Somalia and throughout the Middle East and throughout Africa and throughout. But then they've got future wars planned, right?
Right.
And it's like, all right, how do we? I mean, there's some really great organizing that is happening to try to build solidarity with folks in China. There's actually I heard some really inspiring stories early last year where on the very local level, there were some cities U.S. cities that had like sister cities in China.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Like where they were hit by coronavirus for earlier. And we're like, well, let's exchange some PPE. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Things like that are really hopeful, So I think that it's like you were saying, like what we do locally and regionally, really can matter when we're talking about moving things in a different direction globally. But then I think it's that much more important for those of us who do have that like global outlook to really promote that in this country. And my last point I just want to say, like it goes to how much effort there is to prevent that kind of transnational consciousness. I'm just thinking about the attack on the Capitol. There were so many U.S. officials who said, what happened in the Capitol, that happens in third world nations.
Right.
Yeah, that happens in banana republics. And the whole idea is to say, we have one way of living and they have another way of living. Mm-hmm. We don't accept this here. That's acceptable there. Obscuring the state violence that and the far right violence that people here live with and have lived with literally for the entire history of this country, called the United States, but also obscuring the role that the United States plays in fomenting the violence over there, right? I mean, like like, think about, like, this should be a time of like real reckoning where we're like, whoa, let's look at this society. And you have these powerful people stepping in to say, hold on, we're going to restore, America. And part of that means this us and them thing. Right. So we as in, progressives, folks on the left, we've really got to combat that nationalism and build internationalism.
Well, if you noticed, that's a great way to end, and we might just cut it off, so I'll probably edit this comment out, but I wanted to just mention this to you. But if you noticed, a lot of the videos that were featured on Wednesday did not just feature American flags. So another thing I think for the left to keep in mind is that the right has been organizing internationally for a long time, and they see themselves as bound up in an international fight. I know Sergio's good friends live in Italy. He went to grad school out in Europe as well. His family's from Ukraine. And Steve Bannon's opening up a university in Italy. It's a private think tank in Italy. He's about to open up another one in Hungary. We've got Nigel Farage. We've got the Le Pens of the world. We've got the Golden Dawns of the world. I mean, I just think I'm reading a book. Anyway, I will leave you with this, but I'm not sure if you've ever read Kathleen Bellew's Bring the War Home.
No.
It's an excellent book about the history of the white power movement and it being sort of inherently wrapped up with the post-Vietnam generation of veterans who came home and then started to arm themselves. In my opinion, it is one of the most important books people can read right now in this context, and especially following last Wednesday. But one of the points she makes, of course, is that in the 80s, it was like right at the moment that the left was fragmenting because of internal division and government surveillance and infiltration, was right at the time that the white power movement was dropping a lot of their fragmentation and sort of, sectarian division and saying, hey, we have to come together as a movement. It takes off from there. You will not be disappointed by that book.
Yeah,
I mean, I really right now people are, I'm sure as they're asking you, like, what are you reading? What do you think? This is like number one on my list. So
awesome.
Yeah. Hey, man, thank you so much for your time. This was an enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, such a pleasure. I'm really grateful to just be in touch with you too. And shout out to the work you're doing, in Michigan City, because it reminds me of what I was talking about in my childhood, like this place of social justice, our little city.
Yeah.
And in some ways, there's more possibility, I think about this, like in Albany, these activists had at some point gotten a building, and I'm like, there is, like, in the city of Boston, there's no way like a bunch of radicals just get a building.
It's funny you say that, because when we opened this place, we had friends in Chicago who were like, you should open a place in Chicago. And we're like, do you know how much our community center costs here? We're like, it costs $600 a month to rent this place. And they're just, and it's 1,500 square feet. So it's like, we have a storefront, like this is a fake wall behind me, but this is like a big open storefront that's 1,500 square feet. In the front, Sergio lives in an apartment and I have an apartment in the back. And like for the whole building, it's $1,500 a month.
Wow.
And it's like, people like in Chicago, they'd be like, yeah, that'd be about $8-10 grand a month. I'm like, oh,
right. Yeah, exactly.
No, you're very right, man. And the challenge we face is like exactly what you said, which is if these folks locally, like we can do as much as we can locally, if it's not connected to national and international movements, it'll be for naught. And if those international and national movements don't start to connect like at the granular level with like these differences and so on, I have a hard time seeing how, in other words, we need all of it, man.
Yes.
We need all of it.
Completely agree.
Hey, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Likewise. No, this is really,
let's be in touch.
Yeah, definitely. Please keep in touch. All right. Beautiful.
Take care. Peace. You've been watching Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we'll see you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.